Thanks to both of my commentators. My responses are very brief. First to Jason, who suggested that my account of intentional action as, barring considerations from epiphenomenalism, intentional action as intentions causing bodily movements was a mistaken one, and there weren't such events as intentions, or normally, but it was the case that the subject is aware of certain things and responding in a certain way to them, and action, as it were, for example, avoiding a puddle as you walk along the road, I suppose, might be an example, was a matter of being guided by seeing the puddle and walking accordingly. That might be right for some sorts of intentional actions, but it clearly isn't right for the sort of thing where we decide on our future way of life and then put it into action. This is clearly a mental event which then leads to something we do subsequently. And in any case, it won't make any difference to my basic point, because awareness is clearly a mental property. And if what the subjects of experiments are reporting is that they think they're reporting the time at which they formed an intention, but really they're reporting the time at which they become aware of something, well, that won't make any difference to the basic point that we only believe what they say because we think that awareness is the cause of what they say, so the basic argument remains. My thanks to Dan for pointing out that the title of my paper had been advertised in various ways in various places, and I apologize for that. The paper which I was in fact giving was the impossibility of proving that human behavior is determined. It was a thesis about human behavior. But of course, if what I have said is correct, then it would follow that it was impossible to prove that determinism as such was true. But I wasn't concerned merely with physical determinism, and I'm sorry that my title got advertised in that way in certain places, and I think that was my fault, because I think I changed my mind about what I was going to talk about, and I apologize for that. What I purport to have shown is that we are never justified in believing that our actions are determined, but of course it might be the case that they are. Our justification for believing these things, I was assuming, Dan pointed out, was a matter of having scientific evidence for it. But he also pointed out that we might have certain other sorts of evidence, and I agree with that, and perhaps I should have said that. But then one wonders what that other kind of evidence might be. Some strict Calvinists claim that the Bible says this, and they believe everything that the Bible says, so that might be a reason. It might well be a reason, that is to say, we might have theological reasons for supposing this to be true. I'm very happy with that suggestion. I don't think there are theological reasons for believing it to be true, but that is certainly a possibility. But I was making the point that there couldn't be scientific reasons of the normal kind for believing that our actions are, all of them, determined either by our brain states or by our brain and mental states.
Thank you, Professor Swinburne. Professor O'Connor.
I too want to thank both Emily and Eric for really good comments. So Emily focused just right in on a very basic methodological question, which is about priority of theological considerations versus philosophical and or scientific considerations. All right. Right. So she asked the priority question methodologically of theological versus scientific philosophical considerations. Well, it seems to me I don't know that I even have to face this question. I mean, you do face a priority question where there's outright conflict, right? So if there was outright conflict between something taught theologically and something that seemed to be indicated defeasibly by other evidence, then how you prioritize would make a big difference to what conclusion you ended up drawing in the face of that conflict. But I see the situation when it comes to thinking about the nature of human persons as this. We have simultaneously three sources of data. We have our own introspective data of being subjects of experience and knowing what it's like to be a conscious agent, and that all by itself leads me to a variety of dualism already, a kind of property, at minimum, a property dualism. Then we have theological data, what the Bible tells us about the value of human persons and the nature of human persons, and also the fate of human persons. And then we've got increasingly scientific information, especially since the 1950s onward, about the functioning of our brains and how intimately tied up our cognitive capacities are with the specific functionings of specific regions of the brain in a way that Eric was alluding to in perceptual cases. So it's not clear to me that even if I just focused foremost or even primarily just on the theological, say I just ignored any kind of scientific considerations, that this would most naturally lead to a mind-body dualist view. Because even for the dualist, my survival of death depends on the God acting in a way that doesn't just fall out of natural nature. Christians are not Platonists about the soul. We don't believe the soul is naturally immortal, right? It exists. If it continues to exist, it exists because God wills it to continue to exist. And long before science came along, it was quite evident that conscious experience depends on our bodies being intact in reasonable ways. You know, if Greg hits me over the head with his microphone because he's so outraged at things he hears me saying, I quickly lose conscious experience, right? This is a familiar, ordinary fact. So I know there's some kind of causal dependency going on there with what's going on in my head and my ordinarily having conscious experience. And so then we theorize, right? And it's clear that God's going to be involved in our survival of death. It's going to be a gift of God. We could think of it as God just preserving the soul in existence miraculously, right? Or contrary to the way things happen now. Or we can think of it in my funky kind of way of God's giving the constituents of our bodies the capacities to sustain processes in a certain sort of way. So I don't know that makes much difference. So I don't really think of myself as prioritizing, but I do want to accommodate the full range of data. Eric raised questions about objectual unity, what he called the object property binding problem, the fact that different regions of our brain are involved in detecting features of our environment, and yet somehow they all come together in experience. So when I look over at these folks over here, I don't just see colors. I have experience of color, experience of shapes, experience of sounds, and so forth. They all come together in a single sort of conscious experience, perceptual experience. And also he said there's subjective unity, that I experience myself as a single thinking, willing, acting agent, even though I've got all these physical component systems that are quite separated from one another, that in some sense physically subserve those capacities. And I guess I don't see here why this pushes taking seriously the phenomena of unity of experience, unity of the perceiving subject, pushes us to suppose that I am a simple mental substance, as the dualist supposes. It's important to see that my view is not a version of physicalism, okay? That is, I believe that conscious experiences are not identical to, are wholly distinct from, states of physical systems, the physical subsystems of my brain. right? These are, that's why I emphasize strong emergence, right? And so it's I, the whole organism, that am the bearer of psychological states. It's not constituent systems of my brain that are the bearers of psychological states. I am, right? These subsystems cause or causally contribute to my having these states of awareness, various kinds of experiential states that I have. But again, they're not constituted by or complex physical states. And so the unity that I have and the unity of my experience is it's sui generis. It's part of the experience itself. Conscious psychological experiences for me are non-physical experiences. They're not physically constituted at all. They're caused by. So then the question, the empirical question, which is, I leave that for the scientist happily, is how does it come to be that specialized physical subsystems can give rise to, causally generate wholly distinct psychological states of whole organisms? That's an interesting question, but it's not a sort of philosophical question.
Okay, well, we've got plenty on the table. Why don't we open it up for a time of Q&A from the audience?
Hi, my remarks are directed to Professor O'Connor. I was delighted by your paper, partly because I think if you include some of the insights of Professor Larocque, you are a Thomist. And essentially, your paper, it seems to me, your paper is reinterpreting in modern philosophical emergentist jargon Aristotle's physics. Okay? The distinctions you make are in Aristotle's physics. The distinctions between artifacts and living organisms, unity across the substantial form that creates the unity across time of living organisms and so on. I mean, essentially, you are a Thomist. You're setting aside this sort of Platonic Augustinian mind-body dualism, and you're accepting a Thomistic vision that man is not his soul, that there's the soul, which is immaterial, and that there's the body, and that these together form consciousness. And that is what St. Thomas basically points out in his Summa Contra Gentiles and also the Summa Theologica. And it permits you to address some of the concerns of Professor Larocque, because St. Thomas does say that once the individual dies, he is given a specific grace by God, that substantial form that has powers that are exercised through a body continue through a special grace that God gives the soul or the substantial form, continues at least in intellect and will. But then at the resurrection, the full gamut of conscious experience returns to that. You have memories, you have will, you have all the sorts of things that we have, but even more so because we will have a glorified body, a body that is imperishable and immortal and so on. Distinctly different than the body that we have now. So I'm very delighted by your paper. I think I'll go out and buy your book afterwards. Could you comment? I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah, so just briefly, I'd be delighted to have Aquinas as an ally. A former teacher, a graduate teacher of mine said that here's the way to become known as a great philosopher in the history of philosophy. The first condition, which is the difficult condition to meet, is to be obviously very smart and creative and write all kinds of interesting things that people see that you're really a deep thinking philosopher. But then the second important condition is that you be systematically ambiguous on all the great questions of philosophy. When you think about Aristotle, Aquinas, Leibniz, it really seems, Kant, they're all this way, right? And then people will forever debate about how to interpret them. I agree with you that some of what Aquinas can sound like something in the neighborhood of what I'm saying, but then there are also modern day interpreters of Aquinas who read him as basically a mind-body dualist. He lends himself to multiple interpretations. But there's some of what he says I agree, I resonate with. He does want to see the soul as intimately bound up with the body and not just in a temporary sort of causal unity.
Mark Baker.
Yeah, I have a slightly technical cognitive science-y question for Swinburne, et cetera, and a very simplistic question for O'Connor, et cetera. So first for Swinburne, about the Libet experiments, I wonder if there isn't a more direct way to question their relevance to free will from a cognitive science perspective. So if you think about what the sub-processing that must be going on to the subjects in the experiment, I think it has to be more complicated than what we think if you just do it. So they're supposed to be looking at this at the time, at the clock, and reporting when they do it. And the idea is that that's something very simple that you can do almost instantaneously. But I sort of doubt it. So first they have to form the intention. Then they have to recognize that they have the intention. This is maybe Jason's awareness. Then they have to attend to the clock. Then they have to perceive what the clock says. Then they have to understand what the clock says maybe, and record it in memory. And I don't see any reason to think why any of these things should be instantaneous. Now suppose all of those steps add up to 0.5 seconds, or maybe 0.7 seconds, then the ability to report the time will lag the formation of the intention by this measurable time. And we have no reason to believe in epiphenomenalism from that layer. So I'd be curious to see if you all think that that works and if that contributes to the discussion. And my very simple question for O'Connor and company is, you made the assumption that the soul is simple, and that seemed like a basic assumption. And I realize that there's some history to that from Descartes and others, and maybe that addresses the unity of consciousness problem. But it seems to me like whatever we know from psychology now and so on is that the soul isn't that simple. Why couldn't we take that from a substance dualism perspective? Think, okay, maybe souls have parts, not material parts, but parts and part-whole relationships and complicated relationships and so on. And then we could have an idea of development and so on within that. It wouldn't be such a static thing from that perspective. There would, of course, still be the question of why that kind of development goes along with the physical development, but there's good chances, I think, that we could say something about that.
Yes. Yes, you are right. All that the subjects were required to do was to report after the event. That's to say, it might have taken them several hundred milliseconds to put it all together, but they were only required after the particular experiment was over, after they'd moved their hand, then to report on when they formed the intention. But there are all sorts of detailed things were muddled in that experiment and in subsequent experiments. That's to say, sometimes subjects were asked when they formed an intention, sometimes they were asked when they formed a desire, sometimes they were asked when they formed a wish, sometimes, etc., and they confused some very different terminology. And it has been questioned how reliable after the event they would be at dating the time of the intention. All of those problems are there, but my point was, even if these detailed problems can be overcome in some way, the basic point remains, that is to say that we can only trust anything they say if we believe that it is they are moved, they are and they are intending that their report of their belief and the intending of the belief of both mental states, they are intending that the words should come out of their mouth reporting them, and therefore they are affirming we can only believe them if we believe there's this causal link. So only if you're many problems, which certainly exist, and various experimenters have done different kinds of experiments which have tried to get over these difficulties, and maybe they will. That is to say, it's been suggested you can do the experiment by the moment the chap thinks he's formed an intention, he presses a button rather than reports afterwards, all sorts of things like that, which might help, but the basic point will remain.
I just want to say I found your suggestion really interesting. I interpret it this way. You might say I've been equating that which is spatial, that which occupies space, as that which is physical, right? And what your suggestion perhaps could be this: what we call the physical is tied to physical science, right? The kinds of properties that physical science trucks in, and but maybe alongside the physical science, extended bodies that physical science treats, you have extended entities, but whose properties are non-physical, but they're extended because they have parts. So they're extended in space, presumably somewhere within our brain or our brain and nervous system, and they develop over time as the body develops. There's a dynamic interaction, so that so that you could tell a kind of an emergentist story. You get a primitive, non-physical kind of substance that comes along right at the beginning of biological maturation, and it develops and grows in tandem. Yeah, I guess if I wanted to be a mind-body dualist, I think this would be a better way to go, because it would at least address the kind of concern I have. And I guess you could say, well, look, it's only been, 10, 15 years that physicists now at least take seriously the idea that much of the matter of our universe has been hitherto unknown, so-called dark matter energy, right? That may actually be the majority of the matter composing our universe. So something vaguely analogous to this, we have localized in association with living bodies of the right kind, capable of giving rise to thinking subjects. But the idea is it gives rise to, you might say in a very general sense of the term body, a kind of body. I don't know if you'd like to use that term. It's a kind of thing that occupies space, is I take it, your view, your suggestion, that we could think of the soul, because it has parts, it can become differentiated over time, that correlates with its increasing psychological complexity. Just
I don't know that logical parts have to be spatial parts.
okay. All right.
Right, so you could have something, you could have, say, one set contains another set,
Okay.
but it's not spatial.
Yeah, but that's an abstract relationship. But okay. All right. But thanks. Yeah.
But just to say that there are whole relationships that aren't spatial.
Yeah.
So further questions from the audience, but let me also invite panelists if at some point you feel an urge to
Well, I can
Jump
just
in.
speak to the
Yeah.
control aspect of the Libet experiment. They've done some of those controls where they've had them time the actual action, and they've seen that there's about a 200 millisecond lag, and so that's not enough to account for the lag between the readiness potential, which leads to bodily movement, and the conscious event of willing or intending, or whatever they call that. And then there's been some further fMRI functional studies in the last couple of years that have shown several seconds before they can use brain activity to predict when the mental event of intending is going to occur, as well as that the action will occur as well.
I believe we have a question on this side. Yeah.
Yeah, and this follows the point that you're making and that Mark is making, and it's just a clarification and then a question for Professor Swinburne. The Libet experiment is over 30 years old, and as you're pointing out, there's now been a lot of follow-up to it. And the simple point that I want to make is a factual point. Libet's name is now very well known, and there's no question that his name tends to be bandied about as though he believed that the readiness potential predicted the movement of the hand. He did not do that. He assertively did not do that. And he wrote some very, very good papers, especially near the end of his life. So Benjamin Libet, as a human being, as a person, assertively did not believe that the readiness potential determined the movement of the hand. And this is where philosophers, I think, have a big contribution to make, because we can now talk about, as Professor Swinburne is pointing out, that we can talk about the readiness potential being related to a wish, a desire, an urge. Those things make sense, and as you are pointing out, they are not the same thing as will, and that's a point where I think philosophers can say something that scientists might actually hear, which is not an easy thing to do. And now the question for Professor Swinburne. While I sympathize entirely with your position, and the results of your paper I agree with and share, and I am extremely sympathetic to the stress that you made in your argumentation about the importance of the individual as an individual. I would also like to point out that there is a very robust field in psychological science called psychometrics. So the issue of measuring psychological states is something that psychology as a science, or as a purported science, takes extremely seriously. And so let's not use the fact that mental states are quote unquote not measurable as some dispositive argument, but rather say, look, they're trying very hard, and I am very supportive of the fact that as scientists they are making very good faith, serious attempts to measure and put numbers on and quantitate psychological states. And all I say is now what our role as theologians, philosophers, and scientists who are sympathetic to these kinds of views could be, is to stop getting the scientists to say that the material states of the brain are causing all of these measurements, and rather say that these psychological measurements enhance our capacity to make the case that you are making, that psychological states have downward causation on the brain, and we now have measurements to demonstrate that.
If you're saying that really some of these mental states, as I call them, can be measured, I'm afraid I don't agree. And nor do I agree that any psychological investigators are getting anywhere near showing that. With regard to sensations, for example, in my book I've got a quotation, which is a quotation from the Oxford Companion to the Mind, edited by Gregory, and I think it was someone called Laming who wrote the article on psychophysics. Now, psychophysics has been at work for 150 years trying to measure the strength of a sensation, and the author of this article within the last few years says no one has ever given any sense to a pain being twice as severe as any other pain. And I think that's just where we are with sensations. And the same applies to the other things we're dealing with. They can all be assessed as one greater or less, but in order to assess how much greater or less, you have to have some sort of ruler to put against them. And that's what can't be done. It applies to beliefs too. There's been great energy over the past 100 years to try to measure the strength of a belief in the sense of how probable one believes the belief to be. And it's easy enough to rank beliefs, but people's behavior is quite compatible with the belief being twice as strong or 3 times as strong, so long as one allows that something else, for example, their desires are weaker by a third or a half or whatever. What I'm getting at, sorry, by those somewhat enigmatic remarks, is the way of measuring the, in this sense, strength of a belief was by somebody's betting habits. If you are offered a bet on a horse at 2 to 1, that's to say you pay £10, and if the horse wins you get back your original £10 plus, if it's at 2 to 1, £20, so you get back £30. And if you are prepared to take the bet at that amount, that shows that you believe that it is at least as the probability that the horse will win is sorry, can't do it all in my head. Is great. The probability that the horse will win is greater than a third. But that will only be the case if you, with regard to, say, a bet of £10. If you are, on the other hand, not prepared to invest £20 at the same odds, then the conclusion might be drawn that, in fact, you don't hold that belief. So the mere fact that you will bet on something at certain odds isn't enough to show how strongly you believe it. It's a matter of how much you value what you would lose as opposed to what you would gain. And therefore, as it were, and of course some people don't think betting's moral anyway, but that doesn't mean to say that they don't believe there are probabilities that the horse will win. So mere study of public betting behavior isn't going to get you the answer. A mere studying of public betting behavior, even if you phase in the odds, the amount that you bet, won't give you the answer, because there are still considerations of whether you think this is a good thing to do anyway. And all you can get out of this is comparative things. That is to say, if somebody is prepared to bet at certain odds but not at other odds for any of his investments, then it follows that they do have a certain belief about probability, about the horse being more probable than a certain amount to win, if you assume that money can assess they value £20 twice as much as they value £10, but that's very unlikely. So all of these things come in, but they'll give you nothing more than comparative ratings. And that's not surprising. The reason for that is the things we can measure are public spatially occupying things, and the reason we can measure them is because rulers stay of the same length, in the sense that you take the ruler away and you put it back again and it will mark the same point on the thing you are measuring. And anyone can do the measuring, and you can measure by putting the ruler a number of times along, and that will say that this is 5 times as long as that. But that sort of thing can't be done with the mental. There aren't mental rulers. That's all there is to it. There aren't public things.
Clinicians need measurements, and psychological states are part of clinical medicine and clinical psychology. Clinicians need measurements. So saying it's impossible doesn't solve a very pragmatic problem in dealing with pathological states, that clinicians need measurements.
Yes, but some people think they need things that can't be had, and that's how it is. I'm not denying that they can say that this pain is very intense or something like that. What I am saying is that they can't say it has an intensity of 0.9 as opposed to 0.8, and that's what it is.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Yeah.
In Dr. O'Connor's very stimulating talk, I was waiting for a differentiation between a human soul and or a human emergent individual and possibly a car's emergent individual as being a composed object which only has certain emergent properties because of its arrangement. And I was wondering if a car would fit that that categorization, and if not, I mean, if so, it's how you would differentiate what you believe from a basic physicalism. If a car has a soul that is qualitatively the same thing as a human.
All right, good. Yeah, I don't think we have any good reason to think cars have overall emergent properties that are, in some strong sense, irreducible to the properties of and relations among their parts. But it is an empirical question. The way I think about emergence, it's always an open question whenever you get what looks like a stable, interestingly organized system, physical system of any kind. Are the properties that we observe, macroscopic properties, are any of these properties kind of emergent, overall properties, or not, right? Prior to the 19th, 20th century advances in science, one might have thought a lot of properties of all kinds of emergent systems, all kinds of complex systems in the world exhibited emergent properties. People used to think chemistry or life itself, right, was a simple quality. They say, just look, Living things are just fundamentally different from non-living things. It must have some simple quality, which is life, right? We now know that's not true, right? That life is a highly complex biochemical phenomena. That doesn't show that there might not be subtly emergent aspects to life per se, but it takes, we've come to learn to be cautious about that. The mere fact that a composed system exhibits a pattern of activity that seems strikingly novel is no proof for something's being an emergent system in my sense. And if you've ever played around with the game of life, the mathematician John Conway, you can go online, Google the game of life. He describes a simple two-dimensional world with grids that obey very simple laws. Cells have properties, live, dead, and they evolve, they transition moment to moment in accordance with simple, you might say, fundamental physical laws, but certain kinds of complexes form in life worlds that then exhibit behavior of their own that you can begin to study without even knowing what the underlying laws of the system are, but they wouldn't be emergent in my sense, right? Because all the action is being fundamentally fixed by what goes on below. So it's an open question. It's interesting that scientists, there are whole fields now since the 50s, complex systems theories, either in specialized field like biology or just very abstract complex systems theory, that use terms like emergence a lot. And they want to say, the wholes constrain the movement of parts, when they're bound up in these sorts of things. I think there's a lot of confusion going on there, if I can step on some scientists' toes, about the way they're using this term emergence. I think for some of them, all they mean is there's an interesting pattern going on at a high level of description that it can be useful to describe the system in terms of, but they're not really saying that it's making a fundamental causal difference to how the object behaves. So I would say, so then you say, well, where do we have evidence for emergence? And I would say the only evidence, positive evidence that I'm aware of that's to me compelling is conscious mental states, right? For familiar Cartesian introspective reasons, I think we have good reasons to say that conscious mental states cannot be identified, individual token mental states, with complex physical states. So I think we have direct evidence of it in our own case. But it's possible that there are non-mental emergent systems. Those would be physical systems because they don't involve mentality, and yet they would be irreducible wholes. So the idea of emergence doesn't automatically mean non-physicalism, right? So mental emergentism is a special case of potentially a broader category.
Tim, sometimes people talk about hives or other kinds of tightly integrated collectives as displaying emergent behavior. Do you think that's, not strictly speaking, true, that the behavior of hives and ant colonies and so forth really is reducible to the causal powers of its component parts?
Well, the fundamental thing, I think, is it's an empirical question. The mere fact that we do get striking, organized forms of behavior, I don't take to be sufficient for emergence, not even good defeasible evidence. It might be a necessary condition, but it's not very strong defeasible evidence because we, again, are aware, either in these simulated little mathematical models, but also in certain low-level phenomena of organized systems that we have good reason to think they're the properties of the whole. I mean, basic chemistry, right? Basic chemical atoms have a characteristic pattern of activity that can be described in quantum mechanical terms. And so there's good reason to think, even though the behavior of whole atoms looks rather different than the behavior of isolated subatomic particles, right, that it's wholly fixed by the subatomic laws governing them. In the cases you raise, I say it's an open question. It would depend on it's a rather audacious claim, I think. I think people have, at least in philosophy circles, I guess it depends on what circles you run around in, but philosophers often take it as just a kind of a breezy reductionist view. Well, of course, in principle all this is fixed by. I think it's an audacious claim, right, to suppose that laws that apply to fundamental isolated particles, in vacuum chambers and such, are the behavior we discern there is sufficient to fix the behavior of everything, no matter how complex and structured the context in which they behave. That's a huge generalization. It may be true for much of the world we observe. I don't, I'm not strongly opposed to supposing it's true, but it's very difficult to determine that, because we can't, after all, apply fundamental quantum mechanics even to something like this lectern and monitor each of the billions of subatomic particles in and around the lectern and show that you could give a complete description of how. You just can't do that. We don't have that computational power or the measurement capacity.
Okay, others, we've got a bit more time for audience, yeah?
Just a quick question. If this is for both Dr. Swinburne and Dr. O'Connor, which of your books would you recommend to begin with on this topic?
I'd recommend Richard's book. The one that has been flying off the table out there. It's a very good book.
And my next question is for Dr. O'Connor. If mental properties supervene on physical properties, does that mean that we can make humans like us?
I'm sorry, I missed the last. Does that mean we can make humans?
Yeah, if mental properties supervene on physical properties, can we make human persons like
in the lab, so to speak? Yeah.
Excuse me.
I guess, yeah, I mean, in principle, because I do believe, I don't think of the coming to be of a human person as, and maybe here's where I depart, here's one point where I depart from Thomas Aquinas. I don't, okay, well, but I don't think of it as a special act of creation that God at a certain point, whether at conception or some other point early in development, as infusing a soul miraculously, right, but not in accordance with natural physical law, right? But I think of it as our mental properties and our identity as a causal outcome of the behavior of our parts, right? So in principle, if we had the capacity to put together pre-biological kinds of materials and arrange them, then right, we could recreate, in principle, those sufficient conditions.
How about one more question from this side of the room here?
Hey, Tim, let me push back a little bit on behalf of Eric and see what you do with this. I think that emergent supervenience is best understood as causal. So to say that some emergent property supervenes is to say the subvenient base causes it. It would seem to me then that emergence would be local and not global, so that what we would have would be that an emergent property would emerge on that part of the base that's causing it directly to come about. It would follow from that, if that's right, that there just would be no global capacity for this general consciousness. And if Eric is right, then there would seem to be empirical evidence for this, that there are different capacities for consciousness that emerge on different regions of the brain. Let's suppose then that when that happens, you get your story, that there's a bare particular that it comes to be, and there's a conferral of a whole individual that emerges there. It would seem to me that the evidence Eric's citing would better be suited by saying that there are many selves inside the brain. I have a color self, an emotion self, rather than there being one self. So it would seem like your view would lend more naturally to a multiplicity of emergent individuals. Any thoughts on that?
Thanks. Yeah, that's a good question. I just see it as pointing to an incompleteness of what I said. That is, I told a toy story, even by philosophical standards, a highly abstract story. And right, if something like an emergentist view is true, it's going to have to be consistent with the idea that not only do I have, a perceptual experience, a visual perceptual experience, which, as you say, is going to be most directly associated with a certain region of my brain, in the visual cortex, an auditory perceptual experience, cognitive thoughts, in my cerebral cortex and so forth, but they're coming together. And so one's going to have to postulate, if you go the emergentist route, a kind of more general, emergent property of awareness, and that somehow they come together in that. I don't have a lot to say about that, but I grant there's a hole that needs to be filled. I don't see that it can't be filled in principle, but we're going to have some kind of notion of structured types of emergent features, and we're going to. That's why I talked about the need for some kind of overall capacities. That's the property of the whole conscious system.
Well, we are at lunchtime, and I think I'll call it the conclusion. So thanks to our speakers. Thank the audience.